Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a Viking longship, 500 miles from the nearest land, surrounded by nothing but endless gray ocean and towering icebergs. The temperature has dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and fierce winds are driving sheets of ice across the deck. Your hands are so numb you can barely grip the rigging, and every breath burns your lungs like fire. But here's the terrifying part: you can't light a fire. Not on this wooden ship, not in these conditions. Not when one spark could send you and your 30 crewmates to a watery grave in the frigid North Atlantic. This was the reality faced by Viking explorers as they pushed further west than any Europeans had ever dared to go. These weren't short coastal hops or summer pleasure cruises. These were epic voyages across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Journeys that could last weeks or even months in conditions that would kill modern sailors equipped with the latest survival gear. How did they do it? How did these medieval mariners not only survive, but thrive in an environment so hostile that it claimed countless lives even among experienced Arctic explorers centuries later? How did they cross the North Atlantic without the warming fires that we consider essential for survival in extreme cold? Tonight, we're going to uncover one of history's most remarkable survival stories, a tale of human ingenuity, adaptation, and sheer determination that allowed the Vikings to become the first Europeans to reach North America, 500 years before Columbus ever set sail. We'll discover the ingenious techniques they developed to generate and conserve body heat without fire, the revolutionary clothing systems that kept them alive in sub-zero temperatures, and the survival strategies that enabled them to endure conditions that would be fatal to most people today. This isn't just a story about ancient navigation or maritime history. It's a masterclass in human survival, a testament to what people can achieve when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. The Vikings didn't just survive the frozen North Atlantic. They conquered it, establishing trade routes and settlements that connected Scandinavia to Greenland, Iceland, and ultimately North America. But their success came at a terrible cost. For every Viking who made it to the New World, countless others perished in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The techniques we're about to explore weren't just clever innovations. They were literally matters of life and death, developed through trial and error by people who understood that a single mistake could mean freezing to death hundreds of miles from help. The story we're about to tell challenges everything we think we know about survival in extreme conditions. It reveals that our ancestors were far more resourceful and resilient than we often imagine, capable of thriving in environments that would challenge even our modern technology. Most importantly, it shows us that the human spirit, when properly prepared and determined, can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. So prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's most extreme survival scenarios, where we'll discover how the Vikings turned the frozen North Atlantic from an impassable barrier into a highway to new worlds. To understand the magnitude of what the Vikings achieved, we must first comprehend the sheer brutality of the North Atlantic environment they chose to challenge. This wasn't simply cold water, it was nature's most efficient killing machine. A maritime environment so hostile that it continues to claim lives even in our modern era of satellite navigation, heated cabins, and emergency rescue services. The North Atlantic between Scandinavia and North America is a graveyard of ships and dreams. The same waters that would later claim the Titanic presented the Vikings with challenges that seem almost insurmountable by today's standards. Water temperatures rarely rise above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even in summer, and in winter, they plummet to just above freezing. At these temperatures, an unprotected human has perhaps 15 minutes of useful consciousness before hypothermia sets in, and death follows within an hour. But temperature was just one of many deadly challenges. The North Atlantic is notorious for its unpredictable weather patterns, where calm seas can transform into mountainous waves within hours. Storms can last for days, driving ships hundreds of miles off course, while pelting crews with freezing rain, sleet, and snow. The combination of high winds and low temperatures creates wind chill factors that can reach minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, conditions that can cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes. The presence of sea ice added another layer of danger to Viking voyages. Pack ice extending south from the Arctic could appear without warning, trapping ships or crushing their hulls like eggshells. Icebergs, some as large as cathedrals, drifted silently through shipping lanes, invisible in fog or darkness until it was too late to avoid them. The Vikings had no radar, no weather forecasting, no radio communication. They faced these dangers with nothing but their own eyes, experience, and intuition. The psychological challenge was perhaps as daunting as the physical one. Imagine spending weeks at sea without seeing land, surrounded by an alien environment where every sound, the crack of ice, the howl of wind, the groan of the ship's timbers could signal impending disaster. The constant stress of survival in such conditions could break even the strongest minds, leading to panic, poor decision-making, and ultimately death. Yet the Vikings not only survived these conditions, they mastered them. They developed navigation techniques that allowed them to find tiny islands in vast oceans, survival strategies that kept them alive in temperatures that would kill most people, and ship designs that could handle the worst the North Atlantic could throw at them. Their success wasn't due to luck or accident. It was the result of generations of accumulated knowledge, careful preparation, and innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. The Viking expansion across the North Atlantic followed a logical progression that reveals their methodical approach to conquering these hostile waters. They didn't simply leap from Norway to North America in a single bound. They established a series of stepping stones, each representing a new level of challenge and achievement. The first major step was the settlement of Iceland in 9th century. This 600-mile journey from Norway was challenging enough, requiring Vikings to cross open ocean for several days while navigating by sun, stars, and the behavior of seabirds. Iceland itself presented new survival challenges. An island of volcanoes and glaciers were traditional. Scandinavian farming techniques had to be adapted to a harsh subarctic environment. From Iceland, the next leap was to Greenland, another 200 miles across the Denmark Strait, some of the most treacherous waters in the North Atlantic. Here, the Vikings encountered true Arctic conditions, with sea ice, polar bears, and winter temperatures that could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The survival techniques they developed in Greenland would prove crucial for their ultimate achievement, the crossing to North America. The final step, from Greenland to what they called Vinland, modern-day Newfoundland, was perhaps the most challenging of all. This 1,200-mile journey across the Labrador Sea required crossing waters that were often choked with ice, navigating by dead reckoning for days at a time, and landing on a completely unknown coast with no guarantee of finding food, water, or shelter. Each of these journeys required the Vikings to push the boundaries of what was possible with medieval technology. They couldn't rely on fires for warmth during the crossing. The risk of setting their wooden ships ablaze was too great. They couldn't count on finding land when their food ran out. The ocean was vast and unforgiving. They couldn't expect rescue if things went wrong. They were literally on their own in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Vikings who made these journeys weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who developed extraordinary techniques for survival. They understood that conquering the North Atlantic required more than just courage and determination. It demanded a complete rethinking of how humans could survive in extreme cold without the warming fires that had been central to human civilization for thousands of years. The techniques they developed weren't just useful for ocean voyages. They became essential survival skills for anyone living in the harsh climates of the North Atlantic islands. The same methods that kept Vikings alive during weeks at sea also enabled them to survive the brutal winters of Iceland and Greenland, where fuel for fires was scarce, and the ability to generate and conserve body heat without combustion could mean the difference between life and death. Understanding the magnitude of the challenge the Vikings faced helps us appreciate the genius of their solutions. They weren't just brave explorers, they were innovative survival experts who developed techniques that remain relevant today for anyone facing extreme cold conditions. Their story is a testament to human adaptability and the power of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of people who refused to accept that the frozen North Atlantic was an impassable barrier to human exploration and settlement. Before we explore the techniques and technologies that enabled Viking survival, we must understand something crucial. The Vikings themselves were biologically and physically adapted to cold in ways that gave them significant advantages over people from warmer climates. These weren't just cultural adaptations, they were actual physiological differences that had been shaped by thousands of years of life in one of the world's harshest environments. The Scandinavian populations from which the Vikings emerged had been living in subarctic conditions for millennia. This long exposure to extreme cold had resulted in several key biological adaptations that modern science is only beginning to understand. These adaptations didn't make the Vikings immune to cold. They still faced all the same dangers of hypothermia and frostbite that threaten anyone in extreme conditions, but they did give them a crucial edge in surviving temperatures that would quickly incapacitate people from warmer regions. One of the most important adaptations was in their circulatory system. People of Northern European descent, particularly those from Scandinavia, tend to have more efficient peripheral circulation than populations from warmer climates. This means their bodies are better at maintaining blood flow to their hands and feet even in cold conditions, reducing the risk of frostbite and maintaining manual dexterity longer than would be possible for someone without this adaptation. The Vikings also benefited from what scientists now call non-shivering thermogenesis, the ability to generate heat through metabolic processes rather than just muscle contractions. People adapted to cold climates have higher concentrations of brown adipose tissue, brown fat, which can burn calories to generate heat without the energy-intensive process of shivering. This adaptation allowed Vikings to maintain core body temperature more efficiently and for longer periods than people without this biological advantage. Their body composition also played a crucial role in cold survival. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings were generally larger and more muscular than their contemporaries from warmer regions. This wasn't just due to diet and lifestyle, it was an adaptation to cold that provided several survival advantages. Larger body mass meant more heat generation and slower heat loss, while increased muscle mass provided both insulation and the ability to generate heat through muscle contractions when necessary. But biological adaptation was only part of the story. The Vikings also underwent rigorous physical conditioning that prepared them for the extreme demands of North Atlantic voyages. From childhood, they were exposed to cold conditions that would gradually increase their tolerance and improve their body's ability to function in low temperatures. This conditioning process, which modern scientists call cold acclimatization, involves a series of physiological changes that occur when the body is regularly exposed to cold stress. The Vikings didn't understand the science behind these changes, but they understood the practical benefits. Children who grew up swimming in frigid fjords, working outdoors in winter, and sleeping in unheated buildings developed enhanced cold tolerance that would serve them well during ocean voyages. The acclimatization process affects multiple body systems. The cardiovascular system becomes more efficient at maintaining circulation to vital organs while preserving blood flow to extremities. The nervous system adapts to function better in cold conditions, maintaining coordination and decision-making ability longer than would be possible in unacclimatized individuals. The metabolic system becomes more efficient at generating heat from food, allowing the body to maintain temperature with fewer calories. Viking training for sea voyages included specific exercises designed to improve cold tolerance and survival skills. Young men who aspired to join raiding or exploration expeditions would practice swimming in cold water, often breaking through ice to do so. This wasn't just about building courage, it was practical training that could save their lives if they fell overboard during a voyage. They also practiced what we might now call cold exposure therapy, deliberately subjecting themselves to extreme cold conditions to build tolerance and learn their body's responses. This included sleeping outdoors in winter, working with minimal clothing in cold conditions, and practicing survival skills in harsh weather. These practices weren't just physical conditioning, they were also mental preparation that built the psychological resilience necessary to function effectively in life-threatening conditions. The Viking diet also played a crucial role in preparing their bodies for cold survival. Their traditional foods were rich in fats and proteins that provided the high-calorie intake necessary for maintaining body temperature in cold conditions. Fish, seal meat, whale blubber, and other marine foods provided not just calories, but also specific nutrients that supported cold adaptation, including omega, 3 fatty acids that helped maintain circulation, and vitamin D that was crucial for bone health in low-light conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings understood the concept of gradual exposure and progressive conditioning. They didn't simply throw inexperienced men into the most extreme conditions and hope for the best. Instead, they developed a systematic approach to building cold tolerance that started in childhood and continued throughout a warrior's career. Young Vikings would begin with short exposures to cold water and gradually increase the duration and intensity of their training. They would start with local voyages in relatively protected waters before attempting longer journeys in more dangerous conditions. This progressive approach allowed their bodies to adapt gradually while building the experience and confidence necessary for survival in extreme conditions. The Vikings also understood the importance of maintaining physical fitness for cold survival. A strong, healthy body generates more heat and can survive longer in extreme conditions than one that is weak or malnourished. Viking society placed great emphasis on physical strength and endurance, not just for combat, but for survival in their harsh environment. Their training included activities that specifically prepared them for the physical demands of ocean voyages, rowing for hours at a time to build the strength and endurance needed for long sea journeys, climbing and balance exercises to develop the agility needed for working on a ship in rough seas, and wrestling and combat training that built overall physical conditioning and mental toughness. The psychological aspects of Viking conditioning were just as important as the physical ones. Living in constant proximity to death and danger created a mental toughness that was essential for survival in extreme conditions. Vikings learned to function effectively despite fear, discomfort, and uncertainty, skills that were crucial when facing the life-threatening challenges of North Atlantic voyages. This combination of biological adaptation, physical conditioning, and psychological preparation gave the Vikings significant advantages in cold survival. But these advantages alone weren't enough to ensure survival during weeks-long voyages across the frozen North Atlantic. They also needed innovative techniques and technologies that could keep them alive without the warming fires that were impossible to maintain on wooden ships in harsh conditions. The Viking approach to cold survival was holistic, combining biological advantages with systematic training and preparation. They understood that surviving in extreme conditions required more than just courage or determination. It required careful preparation, physical conditioning, and the development of specific skills and techniques that could mean the difference between life and death when facing the ultimate test of the frozen North Atlantic. When we think of armor, we typically imagine metal plates and chainmail designed to stop swords and arrows. But for the Vikings crossing the North Atlantic, their most important armor wasn't made of steel. It was made of wool, fur, and leather, carefully designed and layered to create an impenetrable barrier against their deadliest enemy, the cold. The Viking clothing system was perhaps the most advanced cold weather gear of its time, incorporating principles that wouldn't be fully understood by modern science for another 1,000 years. The foundation of Viking cold weather survival was their revolutionary understanding of layering. While most medieval Europeans wore single heavy garments, the Vikings developed a sophisticated multi-layer system that could be adjusted based on activity level, weather conditions, and the specific demands of shipboard life. This wasn't just practical clothing, it was survival technology that could mean the difference between life and death in sub-zero conditions. The base layer of the Viking system was made of fine wool, often from sheep specifically bred for the quality of their fleece. This wasn't the coarse, scratchy wool we might imagine. It was soft, lightweight material that could wick moisture away from the skin while providing insulation even when wet. The Vikings understood something that modern outdoor enthusiasts have only recently rediscovered. Cotton kills in cold conditions, but wool can save your life. The wool base layer served multiple crucial functions. It created a thin layer of warm air next to the skin, providing insulation without bulk. It wicked sweat and moisture away from the body, preventing the dangerous cooling that occurs when wet clothing freezes against the skin. Most importantly, wool retains its insulating properties even when wet, a crucial advantage for people who might be splashed by freezing seawater or caught in sleet and snow. Over the wool base layer, Vikings wore a middle layer that provided the bulk of their insulation. This was typically made of thicker wool or fur, designed to trap warm air while allowing moisture to escape. The middle layer was often adjustable, with openings that could be sealed or opened, depending on activity level and weather conditions. During strenuous work like rowing or handling sails, these openings could be opened to prevent overheating and excessive sweating. When resting or facing extreme cold, they could be sealed to maximize heat retention. The outer layer was where Viking clothing technology truly shone. This was typically made of tightly woven wool that had been treated with lanolin and other natural waterproofing agents, or leather that had been specially prepared to repel water while remaining flexible in cold conditions. The outer layer served as a shell that protected the insulating layers underneath, while providing wind and water resistance. But the Vikings went beyond simple layering. They understood the importance of protecting specific body parts that were most vulnerable to cold injury. Their clothing system included specialized components designed to protect the extremities, where frostbite was most likely to occur and where heat loss could be most dangerous. Viking headgear was particularly sophisticated. They understood that the head could lose up to 40% of the body's heat, so they developed various types of caps and hoods that could provide complete coverage while allowing for the peripheral vision and hearing that were essential for shipboard safety. These weren't just simple wool caps. They were carefully designed pieces that could be adjusted for different conditions and activities. For their hands, Vikings developed a system that balanced protection with the manual dexterity needed for handling ropes, weapons, and ship equipment. They used mittens rather than gloves for maximum warmth, but these mittens were designed with removable fingertip covers that allowed for fine motor work when necessary. The mittens were often connected to the sleeves with cords to prevent loss, a simple innovation that could save lives when dropping. A mitten overboard meant losing a hand to frostbite. Footwear was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Viking cold weather clothing. Feet are particularly vulnerable to cold injury because they're far from the body's core and because they're often wet from snow, ice, or seawater. The Vikings developed a sophisticated boot system that included multiple layers: wool socks, waterproof inner boots, and outer boots designed for specific conditions. The outer boots were often made of sealskin or other marine mammal, leather that was naturally waterproof and remained flexible even in extreme cold. These boots were designed to be loose enough to allow for thick insulation but tight enough to prevent snow and water from entering. They often included removable liners that could be dried and warmed when conditions permitted. The Vikings also understood the importance of ventilation in their clothing system. While it might seem counterintuitive, preventing overheating and excessive sweating was crucial for cold weather survival. Sweat that couldn't escape would eventually cool and freeze, creating a dangerous situation where the person's own moisture became a threat to their survival. To address this, Viking clothing included various ventilation systems, adjustable openings at the neck, wrists, and waist that could be opened or closed as needed, overlapping layers that could be partially opened without exposing the wearer to direct cold, and materials that allowed moisture to escape while preventing cold air from entering. The Vikings also developed specialized clothing for different activities and conditions. Shipboard clothing was different from land-based cold weather gear because it had to account for the unique challenges of life at sea. The constant motion of the ship, the need to work with ropes and rigging, the possibility of being splashed by freezing seawater, and the inability to change or dry clothing for extended periods. Shipboard clothing was typically more tightly fitted to prevent it from catching on rigging or being blown around by wind. It included more waterproof elements because of the constant exposure to spray and precipitation. It was also designed to be more durable because there was no opportunity for repair or replacement during a voyage. The Vikings understood that clothing maintenance was crucial for survival. They developed techniques for keeping their gear dry and functional, even in the harsh conditions of a North Atlantic voyage. This included methods for drying wet clothing using body heat, techniques for waterproofing leather and wool using natural materials, and systems for repairing damaged clothing with limited resources. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings understood that clothing was just one part of a complete survival system. Their clothing worked in conjunction with their shelter systems, their understanding of body heat generation, and their techniques for staying warm without fire. The clothing provided the foundation, but it had to be used intelligently as part of a comprehensive approach to cold weather survival. The Viking clothing system was also designed to be adaptable and modular. Layers could be added or removed as conditions changed, and individual components could be replaced or modified as needed. This flexibility was crucial for long voyages where conditions could change dramatically and where the ability to adapt could mean the difference between life and death. The materials used in Viking clothing were carefully chosen for their specific properties and availability. Wool was preferred for most applications because it was readily available, could be processed using existing technology, and had superior cold weather properties. Fur was used for specific applications where maximum warmth was needed, while leather provided waterproofing and durability for outer layers. The Vikings also understood the importance of fit in cold weather clothing. Clothing that was too tight restricted circulation and reduced insulation, while clothing that was too loose allowed cold air to enter and warm air to escape. They developed techniques for achieving the proper fit that maximized warmth while maintaining the mobility needed for shipboard work. This sophisticated understanding of cold weather clothing gave the Vikings a crucial advantage in their conquest of the North Atlantic. While their contemporaries in warmer climates were still wearing simple single-layer garments, the Vikings had developed a clothing system that was centuries ahead of its time. This technological advantage, combined with their biological adaptations and physical conditioning, provided the foundation for their success in one of the world's most challenging environments. The prohibition against fire on Viking longships wasn't just a safety precaution, it was an absolute necessity that forced these medieval mariners to develop some of the most sophisticated non-combustion heating techniques in human history. When you're surrounded by wooden planks sealed with tar and carrying woolen sails that could ignite in seconds, a single spark doesn't just risk a fire, it guarantees death for everyone aboard. This constraint forced the Vikings to become masters of generating, capturing, and conserving body heat using methods that seem almost magical in their effectiveness. The foundation of Viking heat generation was their understanding of human metabolism as a furnace that could be stoked and controlled through specific techniques. They discovered that the human body, when properly fueled and managed, could generate enough heat to survive even extreme cold, but only if that heat was captured and conserved using sophisticated methods that maximized efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure. The Vikings understood that food was fuel in the most literal sense. During cold weather voyages, they consumed a carefully planned diet designed to maximize heat production while providing sustained energy for the physical demands of shipboard life. This wasn't just about eating more calories. It was about eating the right kinds of calories at the right times to optimize the body's heat-generating capacity. Fats were the cornerstone of the Viking cold weather diet because they provided more than twice the calories per gram of carbohydrates or proteins. But more importantly, the process of metabolizing fats generates more heat than metabolizing other nutrients, a phenomenon known as the thermic effect of food. Vikings carried concentrated fat sources like whale blubber, seal oil, and rendered animal fats that could provide intense bursts of internal heat when consumed. They also understood the timing of food consumption for heat generation. Rather than eating large meals at set times, Vikings on cold weather voyages practiced what we might now call metabolic stoking, consuming small amounts of high-energy foods throughout the day to maintain a constant level of heat production. This technique kept their internal furnaces burning steadily rather than allowing them to cool down between meals. Protein played a crucial role in Viking heat generation because the process of digesting protein requires significant energy, generating heat as a byproduct. They carried dried fish, preserved meats, and other protein sources that could be consumed without cooking, providing both nutrition and internal warming. The Vikings discovered that chewing tough, dried meats not only provided nutrition, but also generated heat through the muscular work of mastication. But food was just one part of their heat generation strategy. The Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for using muscle activity to generate heat without the exhausting process of shivering. They understood that controlled muscle contractions could produce significant heat while conserving energy for other essential tasks. One of their most effective techniques was what we might call isometric heating, tensing and relaxing muscle groups in sequence to generate heat through controlled muscle work. This could be done while sitting or lying down, making it practical for use during rest periods when other forms of heat generation weren't possible. The technique was particularly effective for warming the core and could be maintained for extended periods without exhaustion. The Vikings also developed breathing techniques that could generate and conserve heat. They discovered that controlled breathing exercises could increase circulation, oxygenate the blood more effectively, and generate heat through the muscular work of respiration. These techniques were particularly valuable because they could be practiced continuously without interfering with other activities. One specific breathing technique involved rapid, shallow breathing followed by slow, deep breaths, a pattern that increased heart rate and circulation while generating heat through increased metabolic activity. Another technique focused on breathing warm air into cupped hands and then inhaling it, creating a simple but effective way to warm the respiratory system and prevent heat loss through breathing. Physical positioning and movement were crucial elements of Viking heat conservation. They developed specific techniques for arranging their bodies to minimize heat loss while maximizing the warming effect of shared body heat. These weren't random arrangements. They were carefully designed systems based on understanding how heat moves through and between human bodies. The most famous of these techniques was the Viking huddle, a specific arrangement where crew members would position themselves to create maximum shared warming while maintaining the ability to respond quickly to shipboard emergencies. This wasn't simply sitting close together. It involved specific positioning that maximized skin-to-skin contact in areas where heat transfer was most effective while protecting vulnerable areas from cold exposure. The Vikings understood that different parts of the body generated and lost heat at different rates. They developed techniques for positioning that took advantage of these differences, placing high heat generating areas like the torso in contact with areas that were prone to heat loss, like hands and feet. This created efficient heat transfer systems that could keep entire groups warm using the collective heat generation of the group. They also developed movement techniques that could generate heat without requiring excessive energy expenditure. These included specific exercises that could be performed in the confined space of a ship, movements that increased circulation without causing sweating, and work patterns that alternated between heat-generating activity and heat-conserving rest. The Vikings discovered that certain types of physical work were particularly effective for heat generation. Rowing, for example, engaged large muscle groups and generated significant heat, but it had to be balanced against the energy expenditure and the risk of sweating. They developed rowing techniques that maximized heat generation while minimizing energy waste, including specific stroke patterns and rest intervals that optimized warming effects. Hand and foot warming techniques were particularly important because extremities were most vulnerable to cold injury. The Vikings developed specific exercises and positioning techniques that could restore circulation and warmth to hands and feet even in extreme conditions. These included massage techniques, specific movements that promoted blood flow, and methods for using body heat from warmer areas to warm extremities. One particularly effective technique involved placing cold hands against warm areas of the body, typically the armpits, groin, or stomach where blood vessels were close to the surface and could transfer heat efficiently. This wasn't just about comfort, it was a medical technique that could prevent frostbite and maintain the manual dexterity needed for shipboard work. The Vikings also understood the importance of mental techniques for heat generation and conservation. They discovered that psychological state could significantly affect the body's ability to generate and conserve heat. Fear, panic, and despair could cause the body to waste heat through inefficient responses, while calm confidence could help maintain efficient heat generation and conservation. They developed mental techniques that could help maintain the psychological state necessary for effective heat management. These included meditation-like practices that could calm the mind and regulate breathing, visualization techniques that could help maintain morale during difficult conditions, and group activities that could maintain social cohesion and shared determination. The Vikings also understood that sleep and rest were crucial for heat conservation, but sleeping in cold conditions presented unique challenges. They developed specific techniques for maintaining warmth during sleep, including positioning methods that minimized heat loss, breathing techniques that could be maintained during sleep, and group sleeping arrangements that maximize shared warmth while maintaining safety and readiness. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings understood that heat generation and conservation required constant attention and adjustment. Conditions could change rapidly during North Atlantic voyages, and techniques that worked in one situation might be ineffective or even dangerous in another. They developed the ability to constantly monitor their own and their crewmates' condition, adjusting their heat management techniques as conditions changed. This sophisticated understanding of human heat generation and conservation gave the Vikings a crucial advantage in their conquest of the North Atlantic. While other medieval peoples relied entirely on external heat sources, the Vikings had learned to turn their own bodies into efficient heating systems that could sustain them through the most extreme conditions. These techniques, combined with their advanced clothing systems and survival strategies, provided the foundation for their success in one of the world's most challenging environments. The Viking longship wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a carefully designed survival shelter that had to protect its crew from some of the most hostile conditions on Earth while remaining seaworthy enough to navigate treacherous waters. Every aspect of these vessels, from their revolutionary hull design to their innovative rigging systems, was optimized for survival in the North Atlantic's deadly environment. Understanding how these ships functioned as floating shelters reveals the genius of Viking maritime engineering and explains how crews could survive weeks at sea without the warming fires that other cultures considered essential. The fundamental design of the Viking longship represented a revolutionary approach to maritime. architecture that prioritized survival over comfort. Unlike the high-sided vessels favored by other medieval cultures, Viking ships were deliberately low and sleek, designed to slice through waves rather than ride over them. This design choice had profound implications for crew survival in extreme conditions. The low profile of Viking ships meant that crews were closer to the water, which might seem disadvantageous in cold conditions. However, this design actually provided several crucial survival advantages. The lower center of gravity made the ships more stable in rough seas, reducing the violent motion that could exhaust crews and make it impossible to rest or conserve energy. The streamlined hull also meant that the ships could maintain speed and maneuverability even in heavy weather, allowing them to avoid some of the most dangerous conditions rather than simply enduring them. The construction of Viking ships incorporated sophisticated understanding of how to create shelter spaces within the constraints of a seagoing vessel. The ships featured a series of overlapping planks called clinker construction that created a hull that was both flexible and watertight. This flexibility was crucial for survival in heavy seas. A rigid hull would crack under the stress of North Atlantic storms, while the flexible Viking design could bend and twist with the waves without breaking. But the real genius of Viking ship design lay in how they created protected spaces for the crew within the vessel's structure. The ships featured a series of compartments and sheltered areas that could protect crew members from wind, spray, and precipitation while still allowing them to perform essential shipboard duties. These weren't just random spaces. They were carefully designed survival zones that took advantage of the ship's structure to create microclimates that could mean the difference between life and death. The most important of these sheltered spaces was the area beneath the ship's awning or tent system. Viking ships carried sophisticated portable shelter systems that could be erected over portions of the deck to create protected spaces where crew members could rest, eat, and warm themselves using body heat conservation techniques. These awnings were made of tightly woven wool that had been waterproofed with natural oils and resins, creating a barrier that could keep out wind and precipitation while allowing moisture from the crew to escape. The awning system was designed to be modular and adjustable, allowing the crew to create different configurations depending on weather conditions and the ship's needs. In extreme weather, the entire deck could be covered, creating a tent-like shelter that protected the crew while still allowing access to essential ship functions. In milder conditions, partial awnings could provide shelter for resting crew members while leaving working areas exposed. Beneath these awnings, the Vikings created sophisticated microenvironments that maximized warmth and comfort within the constraints of shipboard life. The deck spaces were carefully arranged to take advantage of the ship's structure for wind protection, with higher areas of the ship providing shelter for lower areas. The crew's personal gear was arranged to create additional windbreaks and insulation, with sea chests and equipment positioned to block cold airflows and create pockets of warmer air. The Vikings also understood how to use the ship's cargo and ballast to create thermal mass that could help regulate temperature within the sheltered spaces. Stones used for ballast would absorb heat during warmer periods and release it slowly during cold periods, helping to moderate temperature swings. Cargo containers and equipment were positioned to create thermal barriers that could help maintain warmth in crew areas. The sleeping arrangements on Viking ships were carefully designed to maximize warmth and safety while accommodating the ship's motion and the need for crew members to respond quickly to emergencies. Rather than individual sleeping spaces, the Vikings used communal sleeping areas where crew members could share body heat while remaining ready for action. These sleeping areas were positioned in the most protected parts of the ship and were designed to keep sleepers secure even in rough seas. The Vikings developed sophisticated bedding systems that could provide insulation and comfort within the constraints of shipboard life. These systems typically included multiple layers of wool and fur that could be arranged to create warm, dry sleeping spaces even when the ship was wet from spray or precipitation. The bedding was designed to be modular and packable, allowing it to serve multiple functions during the day while providing essential warmth and comfort at night. Ventilation was a crucial consideration in Viking ship shelter design. While protection from wind and cold was essential, the ships also needed adequate air circulation to prevent the buildup of moisture and carbon dioxide that could be dangerous in enclosed spaces. The Vikings developed ventilation systems that could provide fresh air while minimizing heat loss, using carefully positioned openings and baffles to create air circulation patterns that maintained air quality without compromising warmth. The rigging and sail systems of Viking ships also served important shelter functions beyond their primary role in propulsion. The large woolen sails could be repositioned to provide additional wind protection when the ship was at anchor or during storms. The rigging lines and masts created frameworks that could support additional shelter materials and provide attachment points for personal gear and equipment. Storage systems on Viking ships were designed to support survival in extreme conditions. Food, water, and essential gear were stored in ways that protected them from freezing, while keeping them accessible when needed. The Vikings developed containers and storage techniques that could keep supplies dry and usable even in the harsh conditions of North Atlantic voyages. Water storage was particularly challenging because fresh water could freeze in extreme cold, making it unavailable when most needed. The Vikings developed techniques for storing water in ways that prevented freezing while keeping it accessible, including insulated containers and methods for using body heat to keep small quantities of water liquid for immediate consumption. The Vikings also understood the importance of maintaining the ship's structure and equipment in extreme conditions. They developed techniques for preventing ice buildup on rigging and sails, methods for keeping essential equipment functional in freezing conditions, and procedures for maintaining the ship's watertight integrity when ice and extreme weather threatened to damage the hull or deck structures. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings designed their ships to be operated efficiently by crews that might be suffering from cold stress and fatigue. All essential ship functions could be performed by crew members wearing heavy, cold weather clothing and potentially suffering from reduced manual dexterity due to cold exposure. The rigging systems, steering mechanisms, and sail controls were all designed to be operable under the worst possible conditions. The Viking ship's role as a shelter extended beyond just protecting the crew from the elements. It also had to provide a platform for the various survival techniques that kept the crew alive during long voyages. The ship's design accommodated the group warming techniques, exercise routines, and food preparation methods that were essential for survival without fire. Every aspect of the ship's layout was optimized to support the human activities that were necessary for survival in extreme conditions. This integration of shelter design with survival techniques made Viking ships uniquely suited for North Atlantic voyages. While other medieval vessels were essentially floating platforms that relied on external heat sources for crew survival, Viking ships were complete survival systems that could sustain human life in conditions that would be fatal in less sophisticated vessels. This technological advantage was crucial to Viking success in exploring and settling the harsh environments of the North Atlantic, islands, and ultimately reaching North America. Navigating the North Atlantic without modern instruments would be challenging enough in good weather, but the Vikings had to find their way across vast expanses of ocean while dealing with fog, storms, and floating ice that could hide landmarks and disrupt normal navigation techniques. Their success in repeatedly crossing these treacherous waters and finding tiny islands in vast oceans represents one of the greatest achievements in the history of navigation, a mastery of natural navigation techniques that allowed them to turn the hostile North Atlantic into a reliable highway for exploration and trade. The foundation of Viking navigation was their deep understanding of the natural world and their ability to read subtle signs that most people would never notice. This wasn't just knowledge, it was a form of environmental literacy that took years to develop and required constant practice and refinement. Viking navigators, known as steersmen, were among the most skilled and respected members of their society, and their knowledge was carefully guarded and passed down through generations of seafaring families. The Vikings' primary navigation tool was the sun, but their techniques for solar navigation were far more sophisticated than simply noting its position in the sky. They understood the sun's movement patterns throughout the year and could use these patterns to determine both direction and approximate latitude, even when the sun was obscured by clouds. They developed techniques for estimating the sun's position even when it wasn't visible, using the color and intensity of light filtering through clouds to maintain their sense of direction during overcast conditions. One of their most ingenious innovations was the use of sunstones, crystals that could reveal the sun's position even when it was hidden behind clouds or fog. These crystals, likely calcite or cordierite, have optical properties that allow them to polarize light in ways that reveal the sun's location. By rotating the crystal and observing how it affected the light, Viking navigators could determine the sun's bearing, even in conditions where it was completely invisible to the naked eye. The Vikings also developed sophisticated techniques for stellar navigation that allowed them to maintain course during the long Arctic nights when the sun wasn't available. They identified key stars and constellations that could guide them across the North Atlantic, and they understood how the apparent position of these stars changed with latitude and season. This knowledge allowed them to navigate accurately, even during the winter months when daylight was limited or non-existent. But perhaps their most remarkable navigation skill was their ability to read the behavior of seabirds to locate land that was still beyond the horizon. Different species of birds had different flight patterns and ranges, and experienced Viking navigators could determine the direction and approximate distance to land by observing bird behavior. Gannets, for example, rarely flew more than 50 miles from their nesting sites, so spotting these birds indicated that land was within a day's sailing. Puffins and other seabirds had different ranges and behaviors that provided additional clues about the location of land. The Vikings learned to read the ocean itself for navigation clues. They could detect the presence of land by observing wave patterns, water color, and the behavior of marine life. Land masses create distinctive wave patterns that can be detected far from shore, and experienced navigators could read these patterns to determine the direction and distance to land. Changes in water color often indicated the presence of underwater features or the outflow from rivers, providing additional clues about the location of land. Ice presented both challenges and opportunities for Viking navigation. While ice could hide landmarks and create dangerous conditions, it also provided valuable navigation information for those who knew how to read it. Different types of ice formed under different conditions and could indicate wind patterns, currents, and the proximity of land. The Vikings learned to distinguish between sea ice, glacial ice, and ice that had formed near shore, using this information to navigate safely through ice-filled waters. The Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for dead reckoning, estimating their position based on their speed, direction, and time traveled. This required accurate methods for measuring these variables under challenging conditions. They estimated speed by observing the movement of foam and debris past the ship, by timing the passage of floating objects from bow to stern, and by using their intimate knowledge of how their ships performed under different wind and sea conditions. Direction was maintained using a combination of solar observation, stellar navigation, and careful attention to wind patterns. The Vikings understood the prevailing wind patterns of the North Atlantic and could use these patterns to maintain course even when other navigation aids weren't available. They also used the flight patterns of birds, the direction of swells, and other natural indicators to maintain their sense of direction during challenging conditions. Time measurement was crucial for dead reckoning, and the Vikings developed several techniques for keeping track of time during voyages. They used the position of the sun and stars, the behavior of crew members, such as hunger and fatigue patterns, and even the burning rate of specially prepared candles or oil lamps to estimate the passage of time. This timekeeping ability was essential for calculating distance traveled and estimating their position. The Vikings also developed sophisticated techniques for coastal navigation that allowed them to navigate safely along dangerous shorelines even in poor visibility. They learned to read the sound of waves breaking on different types of shores, the smell of land carried on offshore breezes, and the behavior of coastal birds and marine life. These techniques allowed them to navigate close to shore for shelter and resupply while avoiding the rocks and reefs that could destroy their ships. Perhaps most remarkably, the Vikings developed techniques for maintaining navigation accuracy over multiple-day voyages when normal landmarks weren't available. They used a combination of dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and environmental observation to maintain course across open ocean for days at a time. This required not just technical skill, but also the mental discipline to maintain careful observation and record-keeping under extremely challenging conditions. The Vikings' navigation techniques were also adapted to the specific challenges of North Atlantic voyages. They understood how Arctic conditions affected normal navigation methods and developed techniques that could work even when traditional methods failed. They learned to navigate in the continuous daylight of Arctic summers and the extended darkness of Arctic winters, adapting their techniques to the unique conditions of high-latitude sailing. Weather prediction was an essential component of Viking navigation because their survival often depended on avoiding the worst storms and taking advantage of favorable conditions. They developed sophisticated techniques for reading weather signs in cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and atmospheric conditions. This weather prediction ability allowed them to time their voyages to take advantage of favorable conditions and seek shelter when dangerous weather was approaching. The Vikings also understood the importance of backup navigation methods and redundant systems. They never relied on a single navigation technique, but always used multiple methods to confirm their position and course. This redundancy was crucial for survival in conditions where a single navigation error could mean missing their destination entirely and sailing into the empty ocean with no hope of rescue. The social aspects of Viking navigation were as important as the technical ones. Navigation. Knowledge was shared among multiple crew members so that the loss of the primary navigator wouldn't doom the entire expedition. The Vikings developed systems for training navigators and passing down navigation, knowledge that ensured the continuity of their navigation traditions across generations. The Vikings' mastery of natural navigation techniques gave them a crucial advantage in exploring the North Atlantic. While other medieval peoples were limited to coastal voyages or short trips across familiar waters, the Vikings could confidently sail across vast expanses of open ocean and reliably find their destinations. This navigation mastery, combined with their survival techniques and ship design, made possible their remarkable achievements in exploration and settlement across the North Atlantic and ultimately to North America. The North Atlantic doesn't forgive mistakes, and Viking crews knew that their survival depended not just on preventing emergencies, but on managing them effectively when they inevitably occurred. Every voyage across these treacherous waters was a series of potential disasters waiting to happen sudden. Storms that could appear without warning, ice floes that could crush a ship like an eggshell, equipment failures that could leave crews helpless in hostile waters. The Vikings' success in these conditions wasn't due to luck or divine intervention. It was the result of sophisticated crisis management techniques that had been developed through generations of hard-won experience in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The Vikings understood that survival in extreme conditions required more than just reacting to emergencies as they occurred. It required constant preparation, systematic risk assessment, and the ability to make life-or-death decisions under extreme stress. They developed crisis management protocols that would be impressive even by modern standards, combining practical emergency procedures with psychological techniques that could keep crews functioning effectively, even when facing seemingly hopeless situations. Storm management was perhaps the most critical survival skill for North Atlantic voyages. because storms were both common and potentially fatal. The Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for predicting storms using natural weather signs, but they also had to be prepared to survive storms that struck without warning or that were too powerful to avoid. Their storm survival techniques were based on understanding how their ships behaved in extreme conditions and how crews could work together to keep the vessel afloat and on course even in mountainous seas. When a major storm struck, Viking crews implemented a systematic response that prioritized the most critical survival tasks while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. The first priority was always securing the ship and crew, ensuring that essential equipment was properly fastened, that crew members were safely positioned, and that the ship was configured for maximum stability and survival. This wasn't just a matter of following a checklist, it required experienced judgment about which risks were most immediate and which could be addressed later. The Vikings developed specific techniques for sailing in extreme weather that allowed them to maintain some control over their ships even in conditions that would overwhelm less experienced crews. They understood how to position their sails and adjust their rigging to maintain stability while making progress toward safety. They knew when to run before a storm and when to try to ride it out, and they had techniques for maintaining steerage even when normal sailing was impossible. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings understood how to manage crew morale and effectiveness during extended emergencies. They knew that panic and despair could be as deadly as any physical threat, and they developed techniques for maintaining discipline and hope even in the most desperate situations. This included specific roles and responsibilities that kept crew members focused on productive activities, communication techniques that maintained coordination even in chaotic conditions, and leadership methods that could inspire confidence and determination when survival seemed impossible. Ice management was another critical survival skill because ice was one of the most dangerous threats in North Atlantic waters. Sea ice could appear suddenly, trapping ships or crushing their hulls, while icebergs could damage or destroy vessels that collided with them. The Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for detecting ice in poor visibility, for navigating through ice fields without becoming trapped, and for escaping from ice that threatened to crush their ships. When trapped in ice, Viking crews had emergency procedures that could sometimes save their ships and lives. They understood how to use the ship's flexibility to survive ice pressure that would crush a rigid vessel, how to cut channels through ice using improvised tools, and how to abandon ships safely if the vessel was doomed. These techniques required not just knowledge, but also the courage and discipline to implement them under extremely dangerous conditions. Equipment failure was a constant threat during North Atlantic voyages because the extreme conditions could damage or destroy essential ship components. The Vikings developed comprehensive repair techniques that could fix almost any damage using the limited materials available on board. They carried spare parts for critical components, improvised replacement materials from other ship parts, and developed techniques for making emergency repairs even in rough seas. Rigging failures were particularly dangerous because they could leave ships helpless in dangerous waters. The Vikings developed emergency rigging techniques that could restore basic sailing capability, even after major damage to sails or rigging lines. They understood how to redistribute loads to undamaged rigging, how to improvise replacement lines from available materials, and how to jury-rig temporary repairs that could get them to safety. Hull damage was perhaps the most serious emergency because it threatened the ship's basic watertight integrity. The Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for emergency hull repairs that could stop leaks and restore structural integrity even in rough conditions. They carried materials specifically for hull repairs and had techniques for making underwater repairs when necessary. They also understood how to manage flooding by redistributing cargo and ballast to maintain the ship's stability even when partially flooded. Medical emergencies were particularly challenging during North Atlantic voyages because crews were isolated from any outside help and had to rely entirely on their own resources. The Vikings developed basic medical techniques that could treat the most common injuries and illnesses that occurred during sea voyages. They understood how to treat hypothermia, frostbite, and other cold-related injuries using the limited resources available on board. Perhaps most importantly, the Vikings understood how to prevent medical emergencies through proper preparation and risk management. They knew how to recognize the early signs of cold-related injuries and how to take preventive action before these conditions became life-threatening. They developed techniques for maintaining crew health and fitness during long voyages, and they understood how to manage the psychological stress that could lead to poor decision-making and increased accident risk. Fire was perhaps the most feared emergency on wooden ships, but the Vikings had to be prepared to deal with fire emergencies, even though they couldn't use fire for heating or cooking. They developed techniques for fighting fires using water, sand, and other available materials, and they understood how to contain fires to prevent them from spreading throughout the ship. They also had procedures for abandoning ship if fire made the vessel uninhabitable. Man-overboard situations were particularly dangerous in North Atlantic conditions because the cold water could kill within minutes. The Vikings developed rapid response techniques for recovering crew members who fell overboard, including specific procedures for maneuvering the ship for rescue, techniques for getting crew members out of the water quickly, and methods for treating hypothermia in rescued crew members. The Vikings also understood the importance of decision-making under extreme stress and developed techniques for maintaining clear thinking even in life-threatening situations. They understood how fear and panic could impair judgment and developed mental techniques for staying calm and focused during emergencies. They also developed decision-making protocols that could help crews make good choices even when under extreme pressure. Communication was crucial during emergencies because crew coordination could mean the difference between life and death. The Vikings developed communication techniques that could work even in extreme noise and chaos, including hand signals, specific calls and responses, and positioning systems that allowed crew members to coordinate their actions even when they couldn't hear each other clearly. The Vikings also understood the importance of learning from emergencies and near misses to improve their survival techniques. They developed methods for analyzing what went wrong during emergencies and for incorporating these lessons into their training and procedures. This continuous improvement process allowed them to refine their crisis management techniques over time and to avoid repeating mistakes that could be fatal. Perhaps most remarkably, the Vikings understood that successful crisis management required not just technical skills, but also the psychological resilience to function effectively under extreme stress. They developed training methods that could prepare crews for the mental challenges of emergency situations, and they understood how to maintain hope and determination even when facing seemingly impossible odds. The Vikings' mastery of crisis management gave them a crucial advantage in conquering the North Atlantic. While other medieval peoples were overwhelmed by the challenges of extreme weather and dangerous conditions, the Vikings had developed systematic approaches to emergency management that allowed them to survive and even thrive in conditions that would defeat less prepared crews. This crisis management expertise, combined with their other survival techniques, made possible their remarkable achievements in exploration and settlement across the hostile waters of the North Atlantic. As our journey through the frozen North Atlantic draws to a close, we find ourselves confronting a truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about human limitations and the power of adaptation. The Vikings didn't just survive the crossing from Scandinavia to North America, they mastered it, turning one of the world's most hostile environments into a highway for exploration, trade, and settlement. Their achievement represents far more than a remarkable feat of navigation or endurance. It stands as one of humanity's greatest triumphs over seemingly impossible odds. The techniques we've explored weren't just clever innovations or interesting historical curiosities, they were literally matters of life and death, developed through generations of trial and error by people who understood that a single mistake could mean freezing to death hundreds of miles from help. Every method for generating body heat, every technique for reading weather signs, every procedure for managing emergencies had been tested in every method for generating body heat, every technique for reading weather signs, every procedure for managing emergencies had been tested in the crucible of the North Atlantic's unforgiving waters. The Vikings who perfected these techniques paid for their knowledge with frostbitten fingers, hypothermic nights, and the constant presence of death as a traveling companion. What makes their achievement even more remarkable is that they accomplished it without any of the technologies we consider essential for cold weather survival. No synthetic insulation, no waterproof breathable fabrics, no GPS navigation, no weather forecasting, no emergency rescue services. They had only their intelligence, their determination, and their willingness to learn from both success and failure. Yet with these simple tools, they achieved something that continues to amaze us today. They turned the frozen North Atlantic from an impassable barrier into a bridge between worlds. The biological adaptations that gave Vikings their edge in cold survival remind us that humans are far more adaptable than we often realize. The Scandinavian populations had spent thousands of years adapting to extreme cold, developing physiological advantages that were passed down through generations. But these genetic gifts were only part of the story. They had to be combined with systematic training, careful preparation, and the accumulation of survival knowledge that transformed ordinary people into Arctic survival experts. The Viking approach to cold weather conditioning reveals sophisticated understanding of human physiology that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for centuries. Their techniques for building cold tolerance through gradual exposure, their understanding of how diet affected heat generation, and their methods for maintaining physical and mental conditioning all demonstrate insights that remain relevant for anyone facing extreme conditions today. Perhaps most impressive was their revolutionary clothing system, a masterpiece of medieval engineering that incorporated principles of layering, moisture management, and heat conservation that wouldn't be fully understood until the modern era. The Vikings proved that survival in extreme cold wasn't just about having warm clothing, it was about having smart clothing that could adapt to changing conditions while maintaining the mobility and functionality needed for survival at sea. Their techniques for generating and conserving body heat without fire represent some of the most ingenious survival innovations in human history. The Vikings understood that the human body could be turned into an efficient heating system through proper fuel, controlled muscle activity, and sophisticated heat conservation techniques. They developed methods for sharing body heat, for using breathing techniques to generate warmth, and for maintaining circulation to prevent frostbite that saved countless lives during their North Atlantic crossings. The Viking longship itself was a marvel of survival engineering, a vessel designed not just for Viking longship transportation, but as a complete life support system that could sustain human life in conditions that would be fatal in less sophisticated craft. Every aspect of these ships, from their flexible hull construction to their sophisticated shelter systems, was optimized for survival in the world's most challenging maritime environment. Their mastery of natural navigation techniques allowed them to find their way across vast expanses of ocean using nothing but their understanding of the natural world. The Vikings proved that human intelligence and careful observation could accomplish what we now do with satellites and computers. Their ability to read the subtle signs of wind, waves, birds, and celestial bodies enabled them to navigate with precision that rivals modern instruments. But perhaps their most crucial skill was crisis management, the ability to function effectively when everything went wrong. The North Atlantic was an environment where emergencies were not just possible, but inevitable. And the Vikings developed systematic approaches to emergency management that could mean the difference between life and death. Their techniques for storm survival, ice navigation, and equipment repair demonstrate the kind of practical problem solving that comes only from facing real dangers with real consequences. The psychological aspects of Viking survival were as important as the physical ones. Living and working in constant proximity to death required mental toughness that went far beyond simple courage. The Vikings developed techniques for maintaining morale, managing fear, and making good decisions under extreme stress that enabled them to function effectively, even in the most desperate situations. The legacy of Viking Arctic mastery extends far beyond their historical achievements. Their techniques and insights remain relevant today for anyone facing extreme conditions, whether they're Arctic explorers, military personnel, or outdoor enthusiasts. The principles they discovered, the importance of layered clothing systems, the value of systematic preparation, the need for redundant survival techniques, continue to save lives in challenging environments around the world. Their achievement also reminds us that human beings are capable of far more than we often dare to imagine. The Vikings didn't have superhuman abilities or access to lost technologies. They were ordinary people who refused to accept that the North Atlantic was an impassable barrier. Through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the willingness to learn from failure, they developed techniques that enabled them to thrive in one of the world's most hostile environments. The Viking expansion across the North Atlantic represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in exploration and settlement. They established thriving communities in Iceland and Greenland, maintained trade routes across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean, and became the first Europeans to reach North America, all without the technologies we consider essential for such achievements. Their success proves that human intelligence, determination, and adaptability can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The environmental challenges that the Vikings faced and overcame also offer lessons for our modern world. As we confront climate change and environmental degradation, the Viking example reminds us that humans can adapt to changing conditions through innovation, cooperation, and the willingness to develop new ways of living. Their techniques for surviving in harsh environments without depleting natural resources offer insights that remain relevant as we face our own environmental challenges. The Viking story also demonstrates the power of accumulated knowledge and cultural learning. The techniques that enabled their North Atlantic crossings weren't developed overnight. They were the result of generations of accumulated experience, with each generation building on the knowledge of their predecessors. This process of continuous learning and improvement enabled them to gradually push the boundaries of what was possible until they achieved the seemingly impossible. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking achievement reminds us that the greatest human accomplishments often come not from having the best technology, but from making the best use of available resources. The Vikings didn't wait for better ships or warmer clothing or more accurate navigation instruments. They worked with what they had and found ways to make it sufficient for their ambitious goals. The techniques that enabled Vikings to survive the frozen North Atlantic without fire represent a masterclass in human adaptability and innovation. They prove that with sufficient knowledge, preparation, and determination, humans can survive and even thrive in the most challenging environments on Earth. Their legacy reminds us that the boundaries of human achievement are often limited more by our imagination than by our circumstances. As we face our own challenges in the modern world, whether they're environmental, technological, or social, the Viking example offers both inspiration and practical guidance. They show us that seemingly impossible problems can be solved through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the willingness to learn from both success and failure. They remind us that human beings, working together with shared knowledge and common purpose, can accomplish extraordinary things. The Vikings who crossed the frozen North Atlantic without fire didn't just reach North America, they expanded the boundaries of human possibility. They proved that with sufficient knowledge, skill, and determination, there are no limits to what humans can achieve. Their legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept that something is impossible, who looks at a seemingly insurmountable challenge and asks not, "Can this be done?" but "How can this be done?" The frozen seas of the North Atlantic that once seemed like an impassable barrier became, in Viking hands, a highway to new worlds. Their achievement reminds us that the greatest obstacles often become the greatest opportunities for those who have the vision to see beyond current limitations and the determination to develop the skills necessary to overcome them. The Vikings didn't just survive the crossing to North America, they showed us what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat and commit themselves to mastering the impossible.